Our title for today is the economical esports shopper. I, when we kind of built out this session, talking with Tony and some of the MOSEF leadership, honestly, before the summer conference, one of the bigger needs or kind of something that we talk to schools a lot about in Missouri and across the country is just kind of what are you actually looking for in like a PC configuration when you're looking for a gaming computer? Um, we partnered with Intel, which is a big reason why we're here this afternoon. Big thanks to them. We wanted to put together a webinar for the schools that might be looking at hardware, either coming up this spring, getting ready for next fall, or even just like if you need equipment now, trying to share a little bit of education on what to look for in components and how do you actually kind of decipher what goes into your gaming PC for our esports programs. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Again, big shout out to Intel. They're a big reason why we're able to put together some of this great content and share it with all you folks. So we'll definitely want to give them their flowers, so to speak, and shout them out as we're here today. So diving in, just a super quick introduction. My name's Josh. I've been lucky enough to meet quite a few people in the state of Missouri, and have really found some good friends down there. But I got my start in the esports world back in 2016 at the University of Jamestown. So if you'll notice, my accent is definitely I'm from North Dakota originally. You will hear that the Norwegian is strong. But got the privilege of starting a collegiate program back almost, I guess, 8 years ago now, which seems crazy. But we built one of the first 20 collegiate programs in the country, recruited students from all over the U.S. And I did that for 3.5 years, and it was awesome to be involved with kind of the early wave of collegiate esports. I was a ByteSpeed customer back then, so I've kind of seen both sides of it. And in 2019, was looking for a little bit of a change and found my way actually to ByteSpeed to take over the Gravity Gaming department. And that's my current role here at the company as the solutions director for our esports, virtual reality, all that kind of good stuff. I try and stay busy in the esports world and up to date on what's happening outside of just the tech side of things. I was on the NACAD advisory board for 6 years. It was a great chance for me to, again, try and help pass on the knowledge of building out my own program and some of the things that we've learned here at ByteSpeed and share that with schools all across the country. And I still serve as advisory board member for Marshalltown Community College in Iowa. They're doing some really cool things on the academic side of an esports program, and we meet once or twice a semester, just kind of help steer that program forward. But that's enough about me. My contact info and all that jazz will be at the end of the presentation. Feel free to jot down questions, and if we don't get to them today, feel free to get a hold of me afterwards. If you're watching the recording on YouTube, please feel free to shoot me a message afterwards too. Would love to help in any way we can. So let's dive into the meat and potatoes and quit talking about me. What is actually important when we're talking about computers and hardware and outfitting our esports programs with the necessary tech to be successful? A lot of times it comes down to, I think, three things. Number one, cost of the hardware for sure. The use case, what are we actually using those machines for? And then kind of getting the best bang for our buck and making sure that we're in for the longevity and relevancy of that hardware, and making sure that the equipment that I might purchase today will, take care of me for the, time I need it to, whether that be 3 or 4 or 5 years until the next time I get more budget, or if we're on a different kind of sustainability refresh, looking at kind of that term and when we can actually afford to make changes. So it's kind of a balancing act between the three, and we'll kind of go through what a general configuration looks like today, and hopefully show you guys some helpful tips on when you're kind of deciding between components. The first thing that we need to look at when it comes to our equipment for our esports program is that PC. And there's kind of like 5 main components to look at. You know, CPU, RAM, storage, graphics cards, and power supplies are generally the biggest kind of determining factors of like how expensive a machine is, what are its capabilities. These kind of 5 components are generally the things that we look at as the factors that help us out in that regard. I will say, if you have questions today at any point, please feel free. The chat and the Q&A function are open. Feel free to dump those in there. I see the chat has already been used and tested, so feel free to use that Q&A function as well. So we'll dive into these components on the gaming PC. We'll talk a little bit about consoles as well, maybe a little bit about peripherals, and kind of just make sure you've got the right information. So when we're deciding on components, again, it's looking at the overall cost of that build today, as well as like what's the cost to maintain that equipment, and you know, if we have to upgrade it in the future, what are those things going to look like? When we look at like benchmarking gaming machines and kind of looking at like, well, what's entry level, what's mid, what's high end, you know, what actually do we judge those things on? A lot of times it's frames per second. That's kind of the industry standard when you benchmark machines, and that FPS is a good test of how fast that machine can run and how well it'll perform in that gaming environment. So when we get started, the first piece of equipment that we need to look at for the configuration is the CPU. This is the brains of the PC, the boss in the office. I can't take credit for this analogy, but there's a super smart engineer here at ByteSpeed. His name's Robert. He kind of came up with this example of like a PC is like an office building, and the CPU, those are the bosses of the office. They're the ones that actually have the power to sign off on orders. They can actually execute tasks, and they're the ones that are making the decisions and you know, telling everybody else in the office what to do. A CPU functions very similar to that in the spec of a computer, right? They are the ones that are taking that data from other pieces of the computer, you know, actually processing that data and then telling the other components how to use it. The more kind of technical speaking about how do you judge, you know, one processor up against another, there's kind of a couple of general rules of thumb. And this, you know, if you're from a tech background, this is, you know, pretty basic stuff. But not every esports coach has that technical background. So I think it's important to kind of lay out the ground floor on kind of how we differentiate things. On the Intel side, that's one of our sponsors for today. The naming convention up until this most recent launch has been kind of like the i3, i5, i7, i9. And generally, the higher up that number, the higher performance of that piece of equipment. So generally, an i7 is better than an i5, an i9 is better than an i7, and so and so. Same thing on the AMD side of the house. Ryzen 5 is generally that mid-level, entry-level processor. Ryzen 7s are a little bit higher spec, and Ryzen 9s are obviously the top of the line. In general, the higher end CPUs, those i7s, those i9s, those Ryzen 7, Ryzen 9s, they have more cores and more threads. And what this means, if we go back to that office example, is that the more cores that CPU has, the more bosses that are in that office that can handle doing tasks, right? If you've got more cores, that machine can handle more processes at one time. So that's something to keep an eye out for. However, when we talk about gaming performance, a lot of the esports titles nowadays are generally optimized enough to run on very low core counts. So for gaming performance, the number of cores and threads isn't as necessary to look at as far as like you know, overall performance wise. And then you might see a number range that's the gigahertz number when you're looking at processors. That's the clock speed of that processor, essentially how fast that piece of equipment can process that information. So those are things that kind of differentiate you know, one piece of equipment to another. Other factors that you might see, you know, you might see like an Intel processor might have like an i5 14600K. That's an overclockable processor. It just means that we can take that clock speed, that gigahertz number, and we can actually increase that beyond what it's set at like a stock kind of out of the box speed. Overclocking for gaming performance isn't super necessary. We're looking at really like what's your base clock speed at, how fast is it performing, and that's generally where we kind of keep things. If you're doing really high end rendering or you need kind of to boost the performance overall on a bunch of cores or a bunch of threads at the same time. You think like big time video editing or rendering in like Blender or some animation software or things like that. Then maybe like overclocking might help out. But nowadays it's a lot less of a kind of differentiator when it comes to just like building out a gaming PC than it used to be, even like 4 or 5 years ago. The other thing that you might see is like an F next to the SKU number. Those are, just kind of denoting on some CPUs that don't have onboard graphics where they would need a graphics card to be able to have something show up on the screen. These again are not as common as they used to be. You used to be able to find, especially on like the Intel side, the F processors might have saved you a little bit of money because they didn't have that onboard graphics chip. Nowadays, it is pretty common to have everything just has your base onboard graphics, and then obviously we're going to talk about graphics cards here in a little bit as the big driving factor of like the video performance of your machine. So that's a lot of technical stuff on the processor side of things. So like a real world example of like how we can kind of compare is like looking at the minimum requirements of games that are actually going to be played, right? Every esport title out there, or most of them, will have a page dedicated to what are the minimum required spec to play X game. And we'll use Rocket League as an example. It's super popular in Missouri, super popular actually all over the country. And it's kind of like a good baseline of like, if you can build a good gaming PC that can handle Rocket League, chances are that machine will be able to play most of the other titles in a similar kind of spec level, right? So Rocket League, if you look at the requirements and you actually look it up, it'll say, for a processor, your minimum requirements are a dual core processor. So it's just got 2 cores and something with a clock speed of like 2.5 gigahertz, which is pretty average when you look at kind of like a big list of all of the, especially modern day processors. So that's the minimum. The recommended is a quad core CPU at like 3.0 gigahertz. If we're going to look at current modern day examples, let's say we're building out a configuration of like, what do we actually need for a modern gaming PC for like a high school esports program? What I would say is that we're going to look at kind of where the threshold is met for that recommended clock speed and core count. And that's right now the i5 14400. That's a 10 core CPU and has 16 threads. Its clock speed is between 2.5 to 4.7 gigahertz. So we're right off the bat at kind of, if you remember, i5s are generally kind of on the lower scale when it comes to, the full lineup of processors. We're already at an i5 crushing those minimum requirements. So, in the overall landscape of building a PC and looking at, okay, where do I need to spend my money? Maybe I don't need to go for one of those i7s or i9s that'll be more expensive because I'm already greatly surpassing the minimum or recommended spec of the game that we're trying to play. So I don't need to go overboard because it's just extra performance that we don't need. So looking at kind of like cost perspective, and kind of where like an i5, an i7, and an i9 all line up. If you can see, the i5, like I said, has 10 cores. The i7 has 20 cores. The i9 has 24 cores. All of those are well above that minimum and recommended spec. But if you notice the difference in cost between the three, you're going to add about $100 to jump up to that mid-level CPU in an i7. And you're going to spend even more, almost $250 going from that i7 to that i9. And again, if we're looking at like a pass mark rating for like, that chart here at the bottom of the screen, that's just like a general benchmark on the performance of these CPUs. if we're seeing, that pretty substantial leap in performance from an i5 to an i7, again, i5 is getting the job done well beyond what the recommended spec is for the game that we're trying to play. But we do see a big performance jump to go to an i7, again, for about $100. And then we see that $250 jump to go to an i9. We're getting a fraction of a jump when it comes to the overall performance of that machine, right? So we're getting diminishing returns the more money that we're spending. So again, looking at the overall cost of a computer, where am I actually going to spend my money? Maybe it's not worth it to go to that i9. I'm not gaining a ton, but I am spending much more on that piece of hardware. And we haven't even talked about the rest of the machine, right? So it's kind of looking at performance to dollar and kind of finding the right balance for you and what your budget looks like when building out a program. So that's kind of a general rule of thumb. Again, I would rock and roll with that i5, no problem. If we're going to do things like video editing or streaming, or maybe those machines are being used for other curriculum work, stuff beyond just like, hey, we're going to play Rocket League. A lot of times having a mid-tier CPU like an i7 is helpful. Having the more cores, more threads means that we can perform more tasks at the same time. And when we get into stuff like AutoCAD, Adobe, Premiere Pro type stuff, then it is helpful to potentially spend that extra $100 and get that performance boost. So, if we're going to multitask and do a lot more with our computer, maybe that i7 is worth it. Obviously, we're getting a pretty good, almost 40% jump in performance overall, just for that $100 bonus. So definitely good things to think about when it comes to a CPU. The next piece of the puzzle is RAM for our configuration. This is your short-term memory. If we think back to the Office example, the memory, your RAM, are the little workers. They're the Josh Knutsons of the world, right? They're going to go and take a file from a storage cabinet. I'm going to bring it over to the general manager at ByteSpeed and say, hey, can you sign off on this? That's the job of memory in a PC. They take information from your storage, from other pieces of the machine, bring that data back to the CPU, have it get processed, and then send it back out. They're the actual ones that are carrying that data. A lot of times you're going to see the speed represented as a mega transfer per second, or an MTS. And that's just, again, kind of in the same thing how gigahertz operate on a CPU, just how fast that piece of hardware can process information. And then the capacity, the size, a lot of times is represented by gigabytes. So if we go back to actually one quick note before we get to the Rocket League example again, is one big differentiator in a system is single channel versus dual channel memory. And you can think about this kind of like lanes on a highway. If I have one car going down the road at a time, I can only have one car in that lane, one piece of data moving down that highway at a time. And I'm limited if we're just going to use like single channel memory. When I go to dual channel memory, all of a sudden we're adding that second lane of highway. Now I can have twice as much information, twice as many cars driving down the highway, or data moving from place to place in a computer. I can double effectively my speed at the same time. The speed limit or the gigabytes or the speed of the RAM might be the same, might be a 6,000 mega transfers per second, 8 gig stick of RAM. So it might be the same performance, but if I can double my capacity, that definitely helps, especially when we get into like how much RAM do I need in a machine. Dual channel often will outperform the same amount or more capacity in a single channel setting. So if I've got 2 sticks of 8 versus 1 stick of 16, it might still both be 16 gigs of RAM, but that dual channel, that double highway example will often perform better than just the single stick. So definitely best practice is to go for dual channel, or, if we're adding a lot of capacity, a lot of like higher end workstations now have like quad channel or even more RAM than that. But for gaming, if you look at Rocket League again as our example, their minimum requirements is actually just 4 gigs of memory. A recommended spec is 8 gigs, and that definitely is where, for a long time, your just standard gaming computers, that was kind of like the gold standard, right? 8 gigs of RAM was just enough to get by. Over the last 5 years, we've seen a shift more, especially to where like 16 gigs is kind of the sweet spot. Games nowadays, Rocket League might be a little lower maintenance, but there are some other titles out there. If you're playing Overwatch or Valorant or some of the faster paced games, having 16 gigs of RAM is really an added benefit. And if you see on the right hand side of the screen here, it is pretty cost effective to go to that 16 gigs of RAM. I pulled these costs for everything today from Newegg about a week ago. So this is pretty current as far as like what parts cost right now in the marketplace. So for $20, we can go from just one stick of 8, which again hits our minimum recommended standard. But for $20, we can get a big performance lift and go to 2 sticks of 8 for 16 gigs total. That's kind of where the gaming performance and RAM kind of starts to get into that diminishing return kind of conversation, to where, okay, we're going to spend another $40 to go to 32 gigs. And the amount of performance that we're getting on just strictly gaming, it's not as big of a performance increase as, the dollar, shift might be. When we get into multitasking, again, kind of thinking about video editing machines, stuff that does CAD or Adobe or stuff like that. Then if you look at like what their minimum required specs are, or the recommended spec, Adobe Photoshop is sitting at 16 gigs, and then like Premiere Pro, video editing and stuff like that, we are at 32. So I think we're starting to see a trend of where 32 might in the next year or two kind of become the standard, just for how much that we're asking these machines to do over the course of a school day. But for right now, if you're just building a gaming computer, 16 gigs of RAM is kind of the sweet spot as far as cost and performance. Next up is your storage. And this is definitely not the exciting or sexy part of a computer, but it is really important. We need to have stuff stored locally on the machine to be able to launch games and operate. So having a good SSD right now that can store your data on the machine is really important. Capacity is kind of the big thing here. How much space do we actually need? And we'll go to a kind of, again, a recommended kind of section in a second. But form factor is kind of like the other determining factor of like, how much does this cost? What does it do? What does it look like? Spinning hard drives, those HDDs, they're kind of becoming a thing of the past. Storage has gotten so efficient and so cheap that spinning hard drives, unless we're talking about like big mass storage in like a server or a data bank or something like that, we don't see a ton of those anymore, especially not for gaming. You do want that kind of performance of a SATA connection or like a M.2 drive, because it is bolted and connected straight onto the motherboard. The amount of distance that data has to travel is a lot shorter when we're talking about a form factor that plugs directly into the system and doesn't have an extra cable or other things that it might not seem like a big deal in the overall grand scheme of things, but it will kind of affect your performance long term. So M.2 drives are kind of the sweet spot right now. Like I said, storage has become so cheap that it's worth it to kind of go for that form factor. But how much do we need? That's the big question, right? What is actually getting stored on the machines? Is it just games? Is it games and game film for video review? Is it other programs for the academic departments that use those machines? All things to kind of consider. Starting with, how big is your operating system? Windows 11 is as big as it's ever been, and we're dangerously close to the end of Windows 10. So we're at a spot now where Windows 11 is anywhere from like, it's 20 gigs of storage, but you need 64 to be able to install everything. If you add in your common game titles, let's say, hey, we need Epic Games installed so that we can launch Rocket League. There's another 30 gigs of storage that we need. Valorant is 50 gigs on its own. If we're going to have Overwatch, there's another 50 gigs to install Battle.net and have the game installed. So that storage adds up really, really quickly. For a long time at ByteSpeed, we built systems with 500 gigabyte SSDs, and that was kind of enough. But over the last couple of years, storage again has gotten cheaper, and game titles have increasingly become larger and larger. More updates, more stuff happening in those games, more assets to load and store. So we have seen a shift to where most of the systems that we're building have a terabyte solid state drive. And that definitely gives you the headroom too, to be able to record game film, store it on the SSD, and then be able to pull that up later, not have to worry about like, wow, do I save it to the cloud? Is that secure? Is it long-term storage? It'll give you more options in regards to having stuff locally on the machine. Okay, the big one. Graphics cards are definitely the biggest factor when it comes to overall gaming performance in a PC. This is the thing that actually renders what you see on the monitor, on screen. This is doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and is definitely one of the most expensive pieces of the puzzle when it comes to building out a configuration for a computer. You'll see VRAM capacity. That's the 8 gigabyte, 16 gigabyte, 12 gigabyte number, whatever it might be on those graphics cards. It's how much kind of specialized video RAM that it has. And it's a little misleading, especially with modern day graphics cards. It used to be where, more VRAM meant better performance. Nowadays, depending on how the card architecture looks, it might be more efficient, but I have less VRAM. There were a couple of 40 series cards where like the 12 gigabyte version actually overperformed the 16 gigabit version. It's just kind of how the individual pieces of hardware are constructed and built when it comes to manufacturing. So it's a little misleading, but a general rule of thumb is anything over 8 gigs of VRAM is going to be more than enough to play, especially like the esports titles that MOSEF plays and kind of your modern multiplayer games. So when we look into kind of the cost breakdown and performance breakdown, again, going back to Rocket League for our example, it'll say we need a GTX 760 or better. And if anybody's been around gaming PCs for a while, you know that is a old card. So the recommended, not the bare minimum, but the recommended is a 1060, which is three and a half generations ago, is what I'll say. And if we look at like the cost of modern day hardware, and then the performance metric down below, again from Passmark, you'll see that a 1060 is less than the performance of Intel's graphics card now, actually, the A750, which comes in at under $200. So again, our minimum requirement is being exceeded with a piece of equipment that is lower on the scale than like what you might expect. So when looking at an overall PC and looking at the games we're playing, there are some really, really excellent entry-level solutions out there. If you want to kind of, again, the higher up the stack you go, we are spending more money. And in some cases, those upgrades are not quite diminishing because we are seeing pretty meaningful upgrades in between each level on the stack. But we are spending, $100, $150, $200 more each jump up the ladder that we go. So in finding what your budget is and what the sweet spot is, you can kind of make a determination on like which graphics card do we actually need for our team. A lot of the high schools that we work with across the country end up getting something along the lines of like a 4060 for a graphics card. It's still a pretty decent cost. It's a pretty decent as far as like the budget is concerned, and we're right in the middle of like what our current offerings look like on the high school side. I've omitted some of like the really high-end flagship stuff like your 4080, 4090, frankly because there's no need for that for K-12 esports. It's leaving so much performance on the table that you don't need. It's just not worth the cost. When we're talking about doing that kind of multi-purpose video editing, streaming, Photoshop, CAD type work, a lot of times what we'll see is that kind of 4060 Ti, 4070 Super, something that's a little bit higher on the stack. But again, a 4060 Ti is $400. It's not too bad when it's compared to some of the other alternatives out there. So definitely you're going to spend the most out of your overall machine on the GPU. This is the biggest bang for your buck, and it is important to look at, okay, if we've got the extra room to go up a step, maybe it's actually worth it. I do want to talk about peripherals here, and a quick note about monitors. It is really important to pair a monitor that can actually handle the amount of frame rate and can actually push and show what your computer is rendering, and make sure that those two things line up. I've got a slide here in a second that shows the difference between like what your normal office monitor is versus like gaming style monitors. But the important things to look out for when you're deciding which panel to buy is that refresh rate and response time. You'll see that represented as like the Hertz number and the millisecond number a lot of times when you look at monitors. So 60 Hertz is kind of like your baseline standard office monitor. 144 Hertz is like when we start to get into like your gaming level stuff. And then obviously above that is your esports competitive type monitors. As far as size and resolution go, what I will tell you is that 24 inches is really all the bigger you need to go. It does not give you a competitive advantage in most cases to go any bigger than 24 inch. And if you're traveling or going to an event, 99 times out of 100, it's going to be a 24-inch monitor that is sitting in front of you that you're going to sit down and play at. Resolution-wise, kind of the competitive spec that everybody looks for is 1920 by 1080. 2K, 4K, 8K stuff exists, but for fast-paced, multiplayer, competitive games that were played in esports, a lot of times we're trying to maximize frame rate and not necessarily resolution. So as far as like comparing everything, again, that normal office monitor, that 60 Hertz monitor that's sitting on your teacher's desk, or in the business office or in the computer lab that the students have access to, a lot of times my guess is that's going to be a 60 Hertz monitor. That's kind of like your baseline. That is going to show a new frame on the screen every 16.6 milliseconds. Now, that might sound really, really fast, but when it comes to, again, maximizing the frame rate and getting that kind of competitive advantage of being able to see more information faster, there really is a big jump between a 60 Hertz monitor and something like a 144 Hertz monitor. As far as cost is concerned, those 60 Hertz kind of generic office monitors, they're going to be anywhere from like 100 to 150 bucks. And then for $100 more, we get into like the gaming rated stuff. So 144 Hertz is like the gold standard when it comes to gaming monitors. As you can see on the graph, it's a 10 millisecond jump to go from that standard monitor to something that's gaming rated. It's a big, big jump. It's, over 50% better. And it's definitely something that will make an impact in your students and being able to play a game. Beyond that, when we go into kind of what the standard is becoming in like the collegiate world, and sometimes in like the professional world, we're seeing 240 Hertz monitors kind of become the norm. A significantly less large jump between the two. All right, where we cut 10 milliseconds off going from 60 to 144 Hertz. Now going from 144 to 240, we're just getting 2 milliseconds faster. But again, for another $100. So there's that diminishing return there on the performance. And it gets even worse when we go up to 360 at the top of the line. You're going to spend another $150 for another like maybe millisecond and a half, which for high school students and stuff that we're doing in education, it's just not worth the money. The 99% of the deployments that ByteSpeed does are in that 144 hertz range. It really is the gold standard. It's the best bang for your buck as far as performance goes to price, and it's going to do a really good job at giving your students a good experience playing. Then we get into peripherals. So mechanical customization is a little bit part of this as well. Looking at stuff that, number one, it's not going to break the bank, but it will give you the performance that's better than just like your standard office keyboard and mouse, right? I can change the DPI or the sensitivity on a mouse to be slower or faster depending on how fast I move my arm and hand. I can change how tactile or how easy it is to push keys on a keyboard, or they'll be more responsive. They'll register keystrokes a little bit easier than something like your standard office keyboard, right? And a lot of times these hold up better too than like your standard office stuff. I would be very comfortable in saying that you could shoot for $50 a piece on a keyboard, a mouse, and a headset, and come away with really, really great stuff. We're a big fan of Logitech. We're a big supplier of their G series stuff, and I think the G43 or the G432 headset, I think retails for $50. The G213 keyboard is another $50, and then like the G203 mouse is I think $40. So for $150, you can get your station outfitted with some really good entry-level solutions. Peripherals are a lot like basketball shoes, where like every kid is going to kind of have their own preference. But having like a good solid set available for the students who might not afford their own peripherals or might not be able to bring in their own stuff, having a good solid set that you can have for everybody on the team to use is important. And again, it doesn't have to break the bank. And then we get into consoles. This is definitely the most cost-effective way to get into esports, but there are a couple of things to look at from an overall perspective on like kind of tips and tricks. Right now, the Nintendo Switch is kind of king. Super Smash Brothers is massively popular all across the country. You have things like Mario Kart, Splatoon. Oh gosh, I'm forgetting something, I'm sure. But those games that get played on consoles, that's a great way to buy a cheap piece of equipment, get students involved, and there is that competitive scene too. I do recommend, and I'm gonna have to put a big caveat or a big asterisk on this right now. In 3 months, we might be seeing a totally different thing when the new model of the Switch gets announced. We're hoping. But right now, the Switch OLED is kind of like the go-to, in my opinion, as far as like a gaming console for your esports program. It's got the dedicated Ethernet port in the dock. You don't have to mess around with like a USB adapter or something like that, like you would on the base version of the Switch. The screen's a little bit nicer. It's a little bit bigger. And that is the newer version of that console right now. So I'd recommend, if you're trying to outfit stuff, we're going to be competing soon, or we're in the season and we need to get some equipment, a Switch OLED is where I would go. And those should run you about $350. Buy it off the shelf, take it home, get it set up, and get going. The one thing that you will need to know with a Nintendo Switch is you will need the Nintendo Switch Online platform, and that I think is there's a number of different plans that you can get throughout a calendar year. I think the cheapest ones are like $20 or maybe $40 a year. I can't remember exactly, but that'll give you the online capability to go out and play against other schools. Consoles are a huge thing for accessibility. Students that might not be able to use a computer, a lot of times consoles are the fallback or the go-to. There's a lot of different controllers out there that kind of help with those students' needs. And I do recommend looking at getting pro controllers so that you have more students that can play at the same time. A pro controller is going to cost $60 or $70 depending on where you get it. And they are much better, in my opinion, than just trying to like fiddle around with the small Joy-Cons. And then this is definitely where you can utilize some existing equipment in the school. There are a lot of programs that will hook up a Nintendo Switch to a smart board or an IFP that's in the classroom, and you've got your nice big screen there, ready to rock and roll for whatever console play that you need. A Nintendo Switch only pushes 60 hertz to whatever display that it's running. So you don't need to worry about getting like a gaming rated TV or anything like that, because the console can only do 60 hertz. So a lot of times that IFP or that big flat panel that's in the school, those are great fits for your consoles. All right. And that, guys, is everything. A little bit shorter webinar today, just about 40 minutes here on the clock. If anybody has questions, we've definitely got time for that. Again, my contact info is on the screen here. You can either write my number down. Otherwise, that QR code should take you to my dot profile. You can save my contact straight from there. We can book a meeting with my Calendly, talk specifically about your school and about what you need to outfit your program. I hope you learned something today. I know it's a little bit of technical jargon, but if you're kind of from that IT world, it's probably stuff that you've known for a really long time. But I think we've learned over the last 5 years, especially, is that there's people that are running esports programs across the state, across the country that don't have that tech background, and it can be like drinking from a fire hose a little bit. So hopefully, if you're in that boat of, hey, you're the science teacher and the superintendent tapped you on the shoulder and say, hey, go figure out esports. We've hopefully been able to teach you some things and some helpful tricks today when you're talking to your vendors, looking at equipment and trying to figure out the best option for your school. I don't see anything as far as questions in the chat or the Q&A, so I think we could probably wrap up. I just want to say thanks again to Intel specifically for helping us out, putting this webinar on this afternoon. Please show them some love on social media. I know we've been tweeting all week about the webinar and stuff. Follow us on social media. And we're really excited to be helping Missouri for the next few years with informational webinars, equipment for state tournaments, things like that. MOSEF has been an incredible partner, and we've got a lot of friends in Missouri. So really happy and privileged to be able to be here working with you guys this afternoon. Thanks so much. And Kent says, submitted my grant yesterday. We'll keep our fingers crossed and let us know when you get it. We'll hopefully be able to make sure you're taken care of. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your week. Thanksgiving is coming up soon. So have a safe and happy holiday. And we'll be in touch. And if you're going to be at the state tournament, good luck. That's coming up here in just a couple of weeks, I know. So if you're playing in that event, fingers crossed for you. Hopefully you can make a good run. Thanks, everybody. We will see you again next time.